Sign over Grandpa's estate or face court, little bloodless sis. Caroline's voice cut through my office. Like a blade, her perfectly manicured fingers drumming against the mahogany conference table. 4 lawyers flanked her, their briefcases open and documents spread across the surface like weapons of war. My name is Rebecca Mitchell and I'm 35 years old. I run a successful architectural firm in Portland, Oregon, where I've spent the last decade designing sustainable buildings and managing complex construction projects. But none of that mattered to my sister Caroline in this moment. What mattered was that our grandfather Winston had died 3 days ago, and she was here to claim what she believed was rightfully hers. I sat down my coffee and studied the papers they'd thrust at me. The inheritance waiver was thorough. I had to give them credit. It would sign away any claims I might have to Winston's estate, leaving Caroline as the sole beneficiary of what everyone assumed was a $5 million fortune. The house in Lake Oswego, the vintage car collection, the investment portfolio that had sustained him through retirement. You always knew this day would come, Caroline continued, her blue eyes cold as winter. Winston might have pretended to love his little adopted granddaughter, but blood is blood. The courts will see reason when they understand you're not really family. One of her lawyers, a stern man with silver hair, leaned forward. Miss Mitchell, this is a generous offer. Your sister could contest the will based on biological precedents, but she's willing to avoid litigation if you simply acknowledge the natural order of inheritance. I reached for my tea kettle, the familiar ritual calming my nerves. Caroline had always underestimated me, even when we were children. She saw adoption as a weakness, a mark of being unwanted. She never understood that Winston had chosen me, had seen something in a frightened 8-year-old girl that made him fight to bring me into his family despite Caroline's mother's objections. Would anyone like tea? I asked pleasantly, rising to prepare the service. I have some excellent Earl Grey that Winston brought back from his last trip to London. Caroline's face flushed with irritation. This isn't a social visit, Rebecca. Sign the papers. I poured hot water over the tea leaves, watching the amber liquid swirl in the delicate china cups. Winston had taught me this ritual during countless afternoons in his study, where he'd shared stories of his travels and business ventures. Those conversations had been more valuable than Caroline could ever imagine. Of course, I said finally, returning to my seat with the tea service. I understand completely. You want to finalize everything quickly. Settle the estate without complications. I smiled warmly at the lawyers, noting how they shifted uncomfortably under Caroline's expectant gaze. I'll make sure everything is properly handled. Tomorrow morning. Caroline's tension visibly eased, mistaking my calm for surrender. She had no idea that tomorrow morning would bring revelations that would shatter everything she thought she knew about our grandfather's true wealth. The years leading up to this moment had been filled with subtle signs that Caroline chose to ignore, while she focused on her social life and spending Winston's money on designer clothes and expensive vacations. I had quietly built a relationship with our grandfather that went far beyond family dinners and holiday visits. It started when I was in college studying architecture at the University of Oregon. Winston had mentioned during one of our weekly coffee meetings that he was considering some property investments in Europe. His eyes lit up when I showed genuine interest in the market analysis and urban planning aspects of real estate development. Most people see buildings as just structures, he'd said, stirring sugar into his coffee. But you understand that they're part of a larger tapestry connected to economics and culture and human needs. That conversation led to another and then another. Soon, I was helping him research international markets, analyzing property values in London, Barcelona, and Singapore. Caroline never paid attention to these discussions when they happened during family gatherings. She was too busy checking her phone or complaining about her latest relationship drama. Rebecca's always been such a little bookworm, she'd say dismissively when Winston tried to include her in our conversations about overseas investments. I don't understand why you bother with all those boring business talks. Winston would catch my eye across the dinner table and I'd see something flicker there. Disappointment maybe, or recognition of something fundamental about Caroline's character that he was only beginning to fully understand. The real turning point came 2 years ago during Caroline's birthday party. She demanded an expensive celebration at the most exclusive restaurant in downtown Portland, insisting that Winston pay for her friends' meals and drinks. When the bill arrived, she didn't even look at the total before sliding it across the table to him. "Thanks, Grandpa," she'd said breezily. "You're the best." Later that evening, as I helped Winston to his car, he'd been unusually quiet. "She's never even asked about my health," he said finally. "Never wondered if I'm managing financially, never offered to help with anything. She just assumes the money will always be there." I'd driven him home that night, and we'd talked for hours in his study. He'd shown me documents I'd never seen before, property deeds and trust agreements that painted a picture of wealth far beyond what any of us had imagined. The domestic assets Caroline knew about were just the tip of the iceberg. "Been thinking about the future," Winston had said, his voice thoughtful about what legacy really means and who truly understands the responsibility that comes with wealth. Over the following months, those conversations became more frequent and more detailed. Winston began sharing the full scope of his international holdings, explaining how he'd quietly built a global real estate portfolio worth over $20 million, properties in London's financial district, luxury developments in Barcelona, commercial buildings in Singapore's business center. "Caroline sees money as something to spend," he'd observed one afternoon. "But you understand that wealth is a tool for creating something lasting." The transformation in our relationship had been gradual but profound. What started as investment discussions evolved into something much deeper. Winston was preparing me to inherit not just his wealth but his vision for how that wealth should be used. 6 months before his death, Winston had called me to his study for what he described as an important conversation. The room was lined with legal documents, and his attorney, James Crawford, was present via video conference from London. "Rebecca," Winston had begun, his voice steady despite his declining health, "I need you to understand something about your sister that I've been reluctant to acknowledge." He'd pulled out a folder containing printed emails and text messages. Caroline's communications with him over the past year, all focused on money, requests for shopping trips, demands for vacation funding, complaints about her credit card limits. Not once had she asked about his well-being or expressed gratitude for anything beyond the financial support. "She sent me this last week," Winston said, showing me Caroline's latest message. It was a demand for advance inheritance money to buy a new car, written with the casual entitlement of someone ordering coffee. "She doesn't even sign it with love." The contrast was stark when he showed me my own messages from the same period. Questions about his doctor's appointments, offers to help with grocery shopping, thank you notes for advice he'd given me about work challenges. The difference in tone and content was unmistakable. "I've made some decisions," Winston had said, sliding a thick stack of documents across his desk. "The international properties, the offshore accounts, the real estate trusts I've built over the past 15 years, they're all being transferred to you." I'd stared at the papers in shock. Property deeds for buildings in London worth millions. Trust documents for commercial developments in Barcelona. Investment portfolios managed through Singapore banks. The scope was staggering. "Winston, I can't accept this," I'd protested. "It's too much. Caroline is your biological granddaughter." His expression had hardened. "Biology doesn't determine character, Rebecca. You've shown me respect, genuine care, and understanding of responsibility. Caroline has shown me that she views me as a bank account with legs." James Crawford had explained the legal structures Winston had carefully constructed. The domestic assets, the visible wealth that Caroline knew about, would go to her through the traditional will. But the international holdings, the real wealth, had already been transferred to me through a complex series of offshore trusts and foreign corporations. "This has been planned for 3 years," Crawford had explained. "Every transfer was legal, documented, and structured to withstand any challenge. Caroline's lawyers will find nothing irregular about the domestic inheritance because it follows standard probate procedures." As I'd left Winston's house that Evening, documents safely locked in my briefcase, he'd squeezed my hand. "You're the granddaughter of my heart," he'd said quietly. "Blood doesn't make family. Love and respect do." Sitting in my office with Caroline and her legal team, I understood that tomorrow morning would reveal the full scope of Winston's final lesson about the difference between entitlement and inheritance. The next morning arrived with Portland's typical autumn drizzle, the kind of weather that made the city feel intimate and contemplative. I'd spent the night reviewing the documents Winston had entrusted to me, ensuring every detail was perfect for what was about to unfold. Caroline arrived at the offices of Crawford and Associates precisely at 9 a.m., her confidence radiating from every step as she entered the downtown building's marble lobby. She'd brought the same team of lawyers, plus 2 additional associates, clearly expecting this to be a routine matter of dividing Winston's estate according to her assumptions. "I appreciate you being reasonable about this," Caroline said as we rode the elevator to the 23rd floor. She was wearing a new designer dress, probably purchased in anticipation of her inheritance windfall. "I know Winston cared about you in his way, but family law is very clear about biological precedents." Her lead attorney, the silver-haired man from yesterday, nodded approvingly. "Your sister is being quite generous, Miss Mitchell. Many biological heirs would pursue full litigation to ensure adopts receive nothing." I smiled politely, watching the floor numbers climb. They had no idea they were walking into James Crawford's office, where Winston's real estate empire was managed. Caroline had researched domestic probate law, but she'd never bothered to investigate international holdings or offshore trust structures. Crawford greeted us in his spacious office overlooking the Willamette River. He was a distinguished man in his 60s, with the careful precision of someone who'd spent decades structuring complex international transactions. His assistant served coffee and bone china cups while we settled around the conference table. "Before we begin," Crawford said, opening a thick file, "I want to ensure everyone understands the scope of Winston Mitchell's estate planning. There are domestic assets which follow traditional probate procedures and international holdings which are governed by separate legal structures." Caroline's lawyer leaned forward eagerly. "We're prepared to handle any complications. Our research shows the estate consists primarily of the Lake Owego residence vintage automobile collection and domestic investment portfolio valued at approximately $5 million. Crawford nodded thoughtfully. "Yes, those are the domestic assets. They will indeed go to Caroline as the biological heir, minus taxes and administrative fees." He paused, studying the papers before him. "However, that represents roughly 20% of Winston's total wealth." The room fell silent. Caroline's confident expression flickered, replaced by confusion. "What do you mean, 20%? Winston Mitchell built an extensive international real estate portfolio over the past 15 years. Crawford continued, his voice professionally neutral. Properties in London's financial district, commercial developments in Barcelona, luxury residential buildings in Singapore. The total value exceeds $20 million. One of Caroline's lawyers cleared his throat. "If these assets exist, they would still be subject to inheritance law. Biological precedents would apply." Crawford smiled slightly. "That would be true if the assets were part of Winston's estate. However, they were transferred to Rebecca Mitchell through a series of offshore trusts and international corporations 3 years ago. Winston maintained control during his lifetime through management agreements, but legal ownership transferred upon execution of the trust documents." I watched Caroline's face transform as the implications sank in. Her confidence crumbled, replaced by disbelief and growing panic. "That's impossible. He never mentioned any international properties to me." Winston documented his reasons for the transfer quite thoroughly, Crawford said, pulling out another folder. He expressed concern about what he termed transactional family relationships, and wanted to ensure his wealth would be used responsibly rather than simply consumed. Caroline's lead attorney was frantically taking notes. "We'll need to review all documentation. If there's any evidence of undue influence or mental incapacity at the time of transfer." Crawford handed over a thick stack of documents, medical records showing Winston's mental Acuity throughout the transfer process, psychological evaluations confirming his competence, video recordings of him explaining his decisions, audio recordings of conversations with Caroline that influenced his estate planning. As Caroline's team buried themselves in paperwork, I found myself thinking about all those afternoons in Winston's study, learning about international markets and responsible wealth management. He'd been preparing me not just to inherit his fortune, but to understand the weight of that responsibility. The audio recordings were devastating. Crawford played them with clinical precision, each conversation revealing another layer of Caroline's sense of entitlement and disregard for Winston's well-being. "This is from Caroline's birthday dinner 2 years ago," Crawford announced. Pressing play on a digital recorder, Caroline's voice filled the room, young and careless. "Come on, Grandpa. It's just money. You can't take it with you, right? I deserve to enjoy life while I'm young." Caroline polled as she listened to her own words. "That was taken out of context. I was just—" The recording continued with Winston's gentle response. "I understand wanting to enjoy life, Caroline, but I wonder if you've ever thought about where this money comes from or what happens when it's gone." Caroline's laugh on the recording was sharp and dismissive. "That's your job to worry about, not mine. I'm not some boring accountant like Rebecca." Crawford paused the playback. "Winston kept detailed records of family interactions for the past 5 years. Would you like to hear more?" The next recording was even worse. Caroline demanding money for a European vacation, growing angry when Winston suggested she might contribute something toward the cost herself. "I don't understand why you're being so difficult," her recorded voice complained. "You're rich. I'm your granddaughter. End of story." With each recording, Caroline's legal team grew quieter. Her behavior wasn't criminal, but it painted a clear picture of someone who viewed her grandfather as a source of funding rather than a person deserving respect and care. These recordings spanned 3 years. Crawford explained. They document a pattern of transactional interaction that troubled Winston deeply. He began to fear that leaving his wealth to Caroline would result in its rapid depletion through careless spending. In contrast, Crawford played recordings of my conversations with Winston, discussions about sustainable building practices, questions about his health, expressions of gratitude for his guidance. The difference was striking and undeniable. Winston often mentioned Rebecca's genuine interest in his well-being. Crawford noted she was the only family member who ever asked about his doctor's appointments or offered to help with daily tasks as his health declined. Caroline's lead attorney was scrambling now, searching for any legal foothold. Even if the international transfers were legal, surely the emotional manipulation. There was no manipulation, Crawford interrupted. Winston initiated the estate planning process independently. He consulted multiple attorneys, underwent psychiatric evaluation, and carefully considered his options over several years. He pulled out Winston's handwritten letter, his final explanation for his decisions. Crawford's voice was steady as he read. "I have learned that blood relation does not guarantee love, respect, or responsibility. Rebecca has shown me the kind of person I hope to have as my legacy. She understands that wealth is a trust to be stewarded, not a prize to be consumed." Caroline stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. "This is insane. You're telling me that some adopted stranger gets $20 million while I get table scraps. You're receiving the domestic estate," Crawford corrected. "After taxes and fees, approximately $4.2 million. Many people would consider that a substantial inheritance." But Caroline wasn't listening to reason anymore. Her face was flushed with rage and humiliation. She manipulated him. She spent years poisoning his mind against his real family. This has to be fraud. Crawford's expression remained professionally neutral, but I could see the distaste in his eyes. Winston's decision-making process is extensively documented. 3. Independent attorneys reviewed the transfers. 2 medical professionals certified his mental competence. The structure is legally bulletproof. The room fell silent, except for the Sound of Caroline's lawyers whispering urgently among themselves. They were realizing what I had understood from the beginning. Winston had planned this revelation carefully, ensuring that Caroline would learn about her sister's inheritance in the most humbling way possible. The final blow came when Crawford opened his laptop and displayed a video call from London. James Crawford Jr. appeared on screen from his office overlooking the Thames, surrounded by property documents and architectural plans. "Good morning, everyone," the younger Crawford said with crisp British efficiency. "I'm calling to confirm receipt of Rebecca's signed management agreements for the London portfolio. We're ready to proceed with the Barcelona expansion whenever she's prepared to visit the properties." Caroline stared at the screen in disbelief. Barcelona expansion. "The trust documents include provisions for growth," Crawford, Sr. explained. Winston believed Rebecca would not only preserve his wealth, but build upon it responsibly. "The international portfolio is structured to support continued development." I had remained silent through most of the meeting, but now I felt compelled to speak. "Caroline, I never wanted things to happen this way. Winston hoped you would show interest in something beyond his money. He waited for you to ask about his health, his interests, his life." Caroline's voice was hoarser with emotion. "You planned this. You turned him against me." "I spent time with him," I replied quietly. "I listened when he talked about his travels, his business experiences, his dreams for the future. You were always too busy or too bored to engage with anything that didn't involve immediate financial benefit." Crawford pulled out the final document, Winston's personal letter to Caroline. "He wanted you to receive this after learning about the international holdings." Caroline's hands shook as she read Winston's words. "My dear Caroline, I have left you well provided for, but I could not entrust my life's work to someone who sees money as entertainment rather than responsibility. Perhaps this disappointment will teach you what my love and patience could not. That relationships require more than biological connection. They require mutual respect, genuine care, and recognition that other people are more than sources of personal benefit." The letter continued with Winston's hopes for Caroline's future growth, but she crumpled it without finishing, tears of rage and humiliation streaming down her face. Her lead attorney made one final attempt. "We reserve the right to challenge these transfers through international courts. We'll investigate every aspect of this arrangement." Crawford nodded politely. "That is certainly your right. However, I should mention that challenging the international trust would require litigation in 3 separate jurisdictions: London, Barcelona, and Singapore. The legal fees alone would likely exceed the value of Caroline's domestic inheritance." The mathematics of revenge were elegant in their simplicity. Winston had ensured that any attempt to contest his decisions would be financially ruinous for Caroline, while the international holdings remained safely beyond the reach of domestic courts. As Caroline's legal team packed their documents in defeat, she turned to me with eyes full of hurt and fury. "This isn't over, Rebecca. I'll find a way to prove you manipulated him." I met her gaze steadily. "Winston made his choice based on our behavior over many years. Nothing I could say or do would have changed that. If you had shown him genuine love and respect." The truth hung in the air between us, undeniable and final. Caroline had lost more than an inheritance. She had lost the respect of the grandfather who had tried to love her despite her selfishness. As the elevator doors closed on Caroline and her lawyers, I remained in Crawford's office, staring out at the Portland skyline. The city looked different somehow, full of possibilities I was only beginning to understand. "Winston would be proud," Crawford said softly. "He believed you would use his gift wisely." I nodded, feeling the weight of responsibility settling on my shoulders. The international properties weren't just an inheritance. They were a trust, a legacy that demanded careful stewardship and thoughtful growth. 6 months later, I stood in the lobby of my new London office, watching Caroline's final desperate attempt to overturn Winston's estate planning crumble into expensive failure. Her international legal challenge had consumed the entire domestic inheritance, leaving her with crushing debt and no assets beyond her personal belongings. The British High Court's decision was unambiguous. The transfers were executed with full legal compliance and documented mental competence. The plaintiff has provided no evidence of fraud, coercion, or undue influence. Caroline had sold her car, her jewelry, and finally her apartment to fund the litigation. Her lawyers had warned her repeatedly about the costs, but her rage and sense of entitlement had driven her to pursue an unwinnable case across 3 continents. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Bright Hollow Labs' European headquarters, I could see the Thames sparkling in the afternoon sunshine. Winston's London properties had tripled in value since the transfers, and the Barcelona development was already generating significant rental income. My assistant knocked softly on the door. "Miss Mitchell, Caroline is here. She's asking to speak with you." I found my sister in the reception area looking haggard and defeated. Her designer clothes had been replaced by budget attire, and the confident arrogance that had defined her for so long was nowhere to be seen. "Rebecca," she said quietly, her voice from months of stress. "I need to talk to you." We sat in a small conference room overlooking the city. Caroline's hands trembled as she spoke. "I have lost everything. The court cases, the legal fees. I don't even have enough money for rent next month." I studied her face, seeing something I'd never witnessed before. Genuine remorse mixed with desperate fear. "What do you want me to say, Caroline?" "I was wrong," she whispered. "About you? About Grandpa, about everything. I thought family meant automatic entitlement, but I never tried to earn his love or respect." For a moment, I felt a flicker of the old family bond we'd shared as children before Caroline's sense of superiority had poisoned our relationship. "Winston left me a letter too," I said finally, pulling out the envelope I'd carried since his death. "He wrote it, knowing you would challenge the inheritance, knowing you would lose everything in the process." Caroline's eyes widened as I read Winston's words. "Rebecca, if you are reading this to Caroline, it means she has learned the hard lesson I could not teach her through love alone. She is still my granddaughter, and I hope this experience will transform her understanding of what family truly means." The letter continued with Winston's instructions. A trust fund that would provide Caroline with basic living expenses contingent on her demonstrating genuine change through community service and personal growth. "He never wanted you to be destroyed," I explained. "He wanted you to learn the difference between earning something and expecting it." Caroline broke down completely, months of suppressed grief and regret pouring out. "I was so focused on the money that I never saw how much he loved us both. I threw away his love for inheritance I didn't even deserve." I reached across the table and took her hand. "Winston believed people could change, Caroline. He hoped this experience would teach you what his generosity couldn't." Through tears, Caroline asked, "Is there any way could I work for you? Learn about the business, prove that I can be more than just an entitled granddaughter." I looked out at the London skyline, thinking about Winston's final wish for family reconciliation. "The Barcelona office needs an assistant property manager, entry-level position, small salary, lots of learning opportunities." Caroline nodded eagerly. "I'll take it." "Thank you, Rebecca. Thank you for giving me a chance to become someone Grandpa would have been proud of." As we sat together in the fading afternoon light, I realized that Winston's greatest victory wasn't teaching Caroline a lesson about entitlement. It was creating an opportunity for genuine family healing built on respect rather than biological assumption. Caroline's attempted legal challenge had devastating consequences that extended far beyond financial ruin. Her public pursuit of an inheritance that belonged to another heir damaged her social reputation irreparably as former friends and acquaintances learned about her entitled behavior toward Winston and her cruel treatment of her adopted sister. The London court's scathing decision was reported in legal journals across 3 continents, making her name synonymous with frivolous litigation and family greed. Her professional prospects evaporated when potential employers discovered her history of prioritizing money over relationships, and her dating life collapsed when men realized she had attempted to steal millions from her own sister. The stress of losing everything she had taken for granted aged her visibly, forcing her to confront the reality that her entire identity had been built on unearned privilege rather than personal accomplishment. Standing in my Barcelona office 2 years later, overseeing the expansion of Winston's carefully built empire, I reflected on the journey that had brought me from a threatened inheritance to managing a global real estate portfolio worth over $50 million. The revenge had been complete, not because I had taken something from Caroline, but because Winston had used his wisdom to create consequences that would either destroy her or transform her into someone worthy of the family name. As I signed the contracts for our new Singapore development, I understood that the greatest victory was not in punishing those who had wronged me, but in proving myself worthy of the trust Winston had placed in my hands.